Look, we'll push on in the interest of time, and thanks for your patience. Before we get into the detail, very, very appropriate and prudent, we acknowledge and pay our respects to traditional owners, Aboriginal communities and organisations across the landscape, but in particular across the area that these projects are proposed in. We collectively value the partnerships that we have with traditional owners, Aboriginal communities and organisations for the health and of the people and country, and we pay our respects to elders past, present, and recognise the traditional owners' obligations, rights and responsibilities to use and care for their traditional lands and waters. Thanks. Well, unfortunately or fortunately, however you want to characterise it, you've seen a bit of me already thus far. My name's Josh White. I'm the project director for VMFRP. I'll be chairing today's online session, also be providing an overview of VMFRP. I'll also be acting as Dale Coxton. Unfortunately, she's had a late family emergency, and Dale is the project manager. So I'll take over her components as well. And we have with us James David, who is the VMFRP approvals manager. James will step through a number of elements associated with part operations, but the ER process that is being used to assess these three projects, how to make a submission and next steps. I thought it was appropriate to, I guess, clarify whom we don't have with us. We don't have all of our technical specialists or any of our technical specialists that authored elements of the environment report here tonight. They've been on hand in the face-to-face information sessions through the week, but specific technical questions can be responded to. We'll talk through how one might ask questions in this forum and or the upcoming inquiring forum. Thanks, Rachel. We have the ability for people to pop questions in via the moderated chat function. So on the Teams system, there is a chat option. Use that function. We have people in the background collating those questions. They'll pull those together into a thematic type approach, and we'll look to address those at the end. We have received prior to, and people have registered to attend, a number of questions from those people. We'll also look to address those at the end of the presentation as well. Thanks. I'll move into an overview of what VMFRP is from a total project perspective. Noting we're talking about Vinifera, Nyah and Burra Creek here, and their relationship to the overall 9 projects that make up VMFRP. But really, at its heart, VMFRP is a project that is looking to get much needed water back onto the Murray River floodplain at 9 discrete locations. Fair to say, and I think everyone we talk to, without water in these landscapes, there'll be continued decline of these floodplains, and along with that, all of those component parts that make up the complex floodplain, including trees, animals, and plants that all depend on them. And and as we set out in our approvals documentation, the communities as well, the social fabric that that has come to value these floodplains too. Thanks, Rachel. Why are we looking to restore these floodplains? Yeah, fair to say, through colonisation and through river regulation, we have altered the frequency that the River Murray used to spill onto the floodplain. So under natural conditions, it would spill far more regularly, far more frequently, and for longer periods than it does today. Our intensive and very successful efforts at river regulation over the last 100+ years has seen us increasingly disconnect the river from the floodplain, and as such, we are left with a highly efficient but a highly regulated and highly managed river system that values water within the river channel itself rather than water out onto the floodplain, and that's been a consequence of river regulation. Thanks. The question that often gets asked in the various sessions that we get round to is, how do we come up with the 9 projects that make up VMFRP? In a geographic setting, we have a series of projects commencing at Gunbower in the most eastern proximate geographic area for these projects near Echuca, all the way through to the South Australian border near Renmark at Lindsay Island. They were selected for their high biodiversity values. So there was a process undertaken, habitat that was vulnerable, endangered, wetland, Ramsar, whole range of criteria that resulted in selecting these 9 sites. There was an evaluation made that restorative benefits can be achieved. So implementing these projects would see restoration of the floodplain feasibility. So, example, the Hatter Lakes project, where we're leveraging off the existing TLM project there at Hatter Lakes to feasibly get water to these locations, and an understanding of how these floodplains work, and our ability to avoid and or manage risks, and also monitor, adapt to realise a benefit. Thanks. At a high level, the how, there's a VMFRP, while at its heart is a floodplain restoration project, in a delivery or project sense, there's infrastructure as well that we're looking to construct in these landscapes to be able to enable us, in a managed event, introduce and get water onto the floodplain, hold it on the floodplain, and release water off the floodplain across the 9 sites. In part, that involves the construction of new infrastructure. We'll touch on that through the presentation, but it also addresses, in part, removal of some existing blockages on some of the creeks and tributaries across the project sites, including projects that we're talking about this evening. Shouldn't and can't forget that VMFRP is part of the Murray-Darling Basin Plan and goes part way to meeting Victoria's obligations under the Murray-Darling Basin Plan. So it is a construct of the plan and is an outcome of the plan as well. Thanks. Look, these projects are about designing where possible to maximise the existing and naturally occurring flooding events and or high river events. So it affords us the opportunity to utilise those events as well as build on those events, but they are designed to work in concert with naturally occurring flood or high river level events. The use and the construction and operation of infrastructure does enable us to hold water on the floodplain after a flood event, so on the back end of a flood event that may have not had been as longer duration as we would have liked. Our ability to use infrastructure to hold the water there for a longer period of time, and or release it in a controlled or staged event manner back into the River Murray itself. We also, during drier periods of time, which have occurred and under climate change are likely to occur more frequently, the ability to pump water out into these particular project locations to get water onto the floodplain from the river itself up onto the floodplain, using infrastructure to hold it there for a period of time, and then release that back into the river system as well. So there are two mechanisms here, utilising or piggybacking off a natural event or a higher river level event, or using pumping infrastructure to extract water out of the river, put it onto the floodplain, and then release it back to the river after the requisite time periods on the floodplain have been achieved. Thanks. Here's an example, Nyah, pertinent to what we're talking about this evening. There's a, not a before and after, but a pre-VMFRP and a sort of post-VMFRP snapshot there. So what it demonstrates is that with infrastructure, VMFRP being infrastructure in this sense, our ability to reach a larger cross-section of the floodplain as distinct from on the left, where we don't have infrastructure, and really we're constrained to lower parts of the floodplain and existing creeks and watercourses. So VMFRP does, with the construction and operation of infrastructure, enable us to reach a broader or larger portion of the floodplain. Here we are. We're talking about the Parnimaloo Creek, which is at Nyah, in its sort of pre-river regulation times. It would have seen water quite frequently. And we're looking to target a similar number, so relatively frequent watering. That was sort of the nature of the floodplain through this section of the river. Typically, sort of autumn-winter delivery, going into the start of spring. Our current assessment that's borne out through the terrestrial ecology and other studies we've done as part of the environment report, in a little bit of layman's term there, but patchy and declining is the general report card, if you like, for the ecology in this section of the floodplain. Fair to say, not new, this approach. So the site and the delivery method is well understood, both in a natural or high river level process and or a pump process. So these have been done to smaller effect currently and in the recent past. So there is a good understanding of the site and a good understanding of how one is able to get water onto this landscape and manage it on and off the landscape for a beneficial and restorative outcome. Thanks. Look, a stock slide that we've used quite often. A very picture tells 1,000 words. Here's a snapshot, not too far away. Had a Colkine, a before and after shot. I think it's reasonably well understood by everybody that water in these landscapes is beneficial. There's a pretty sort of evidentiary series of images there which demonstrate the before and after watering benefits of environmental water. Thanks. Importance I touched on at the start, and we deal with on a daily basis the importance of cultural heritage, and cultural heritage is not only an understanding of artifacts and other things. It's also an understanding of the connection of traditional owners to these sections of the floodplain, and the importance of the connection to traditional owners and their connection to country here. So there's been extensive and ongoing engagement and collaboration with a broad cross-section of the Aboriginal community right along the river and these project areas, from registered Aboriginal parties to non-registered groups, and we continue to engage with them through the development of the required cultural heritage management plans, operating plans, but also engage with them around the construct of the projects, the construct of how they would operate. And that has been done and continues to be done in concert with those groups, and led by, in this case, the Mallee Catchment Management Authority, who have extensive and deep-seated relationships with the traditional owner groups across their area. Thanks. I was keen to touch on, and people here may have heard the term used, constraints management as well. So VMFRP is not the only project that makes up the Murray-Darling Basin Plan within Victoria. Victoria is also a co-deliverer the constraints management project, which is a project at a high level that reduces or overcomes constraints within the river system, and that is one of the other SDL or Sustainable Diversion Limit projects that has been delivered under the Basin Plan. Constraints management is still very much in its, let's call it, development phase, but I think it's important to characterise VMFRP and constraints as complementary. They work in concert. So constraints management would, in theory, provide an opportunity for more overbank flow within the lower parts of the floodplain. But what they would do in concert with each other is enable water to be held on the floodplain with VMFRP and infrastructure for longer durations or periods of time to achieve sort of better ecological outcomes. So we see constraints management as very much complementary to VMFRP. Thanks, James. Look, would acknowledge though, and we've got another couple of slides here around constraints, that there is a degree of interest within the community around constraints, what it is, how it would operate, etc. So there's a couple of bullet points here that sort of sets out that while they are separate projects and targeting different parts of the landscape, there is an overlap with them, and as I indicated before, they largely work or symbiotic in many ways. So, but what also happens with VMFRP and infrastructure, it affords us to be able to water higher parts of the landscape as well that the constraints wouldn't be able to achieve. So there is a real synergy between the two, and there is still an underlying need for VMFRP to get water into parts of this landscape. Thanks, Rachel. Last slide on constraints, really setting out that there's an opportunity. It's still in development. There's still a lot of work and engagement going on with a range of stakeholders across that project. There's more information to be had around constraints for those that are interested at that website there below. So that would give you a good précis of the status of the project, what it's looking to achieve, and where it's headed, and what sort of levels of engagement are upcoming with that project. Thanks. A quick one, important for let's call it the consumptive, the food and fibre component of the river system and irrigated agriculture along the River Murray, but within the basin plan itself, or the basin itself. These projects, along with the 36 projects that make up the SIDLAM suite of projects, they're really there to use existing environmental water entitlements. They're not there to take more water from the consumptive pool, so it's using the water that's been recovered already in a more efficient manner to get some environmental outcomes. So we're not these projects wouldn't take more water from the consumptive pool, and it enables Victoria to meet its commitments under the plan and the objectives, but still balancing the needs of all the water users and communities along the River Murray as a totality. So it does consider the consumptive users as well in the delivery of the basin plan, and particularly the delivery of these SDL projects. Thanks. We'll move now into, and I'll just have a little drink of water, but the three projects that make up what is called ER Central. So ER being short for Environment Report, and the central sites being those of a geographic construct. So Gunbow, Guttram, Benwell are referred to the eastern projects. The central projects are made up of the three projects we're talking about this evening, that being Nyah, Vinifera and Burra. And then we have the balance of the projects, Belsey, Younger and Hatter Lakes, which are also in a central package, but they've been dealt with under a separate approvals process. And then the western projects being Lindsay and Walpolar Island to the west of Mildura. But we're here to talk about the three projects there highlighted in red. They are being assessed via an environment report. James David, who's our approvals manager, he'll talk through a bit more on the detail of the environment report and how that's being assessed. But I'll deal with the infrastructure in a bit more detail around each of the projects from a construction perspective. Thanks. This is a useful slide, and the majority of these slides and images, and just bear with me for a sec, are available in the mapbook series that is published online, and we'll show you towards the end of the presentation where you can find more of this information. But this image here is an extract from the mapbook. There's a bit of detail in it. It's a footprint for Vinifera. The different colour schemes deal with different component parts, but the blue is the maximum inundation area that this project of Vinifera would inundate. The yellow sections are the construction, what's called the construction footprint. Now that can make up a number of different component parts. It could be an existing track within the Nyah the Vinifera footprint here that we would utilise to access an area that we might want to construct a regulator or something else on. So the construction footprint can comprise simply access, so simply driving along an existing track or road, through to the area where we will construct infrastructure, so a more intense area of activity. And then the last bit would be areas where we're constructing a more linear feature like a containment bank on an existing track. So they're the three areas within the inundation area where we'll be working. And what you'll see, not on this slide because it's not in this one, the other component that we have is area what we call a borrow area. So outside of the park, or in this case Vinifera, we have to obtain some material to bring in to enable us to construct banks and earthworks, etc. And that's done in adjacent private land near these project areas. So that would be the fourth part of a construction footprint that we have. Thanks. I won't go through all of those bullet points in a great deal of detail, but it's a snapshot of the types of infrastructure we're looking to construct at Vinifera. There's gives you an area of maximal inundation area that we would look to inundate as a maximum, so 335 hectares here. We have a range of different regulators. So a regulator is a piece of infrastructure. There's an example there in the centre of the slide. It's essentially a structure that enables the passage of water through, or the ability to control the passage of water through. So effectively gates or valves that sit on one end of that structure that enables you to either prevent the passage of water, enable through flow, so you would extract the valve or the gate completely out of the waterway and let water flow through under natural flood events. That's what would occur, or a hybrid where you're looking to release water in a controlled manner. So you would be controlling the operation of the gate or the valve to release water in a controlled manner. So we have a range of those. The other other features of these projects, no different, what we call containment banks. So these are low-level banks. They're not levees in a more traditional sense. They're not there to sort of prevent flooding. They're there to contain water and the required depth of water on or within the maximum inundation area. There's an example there at the bottom right corner of a containment bank. They typically, in this case, that does occur, they would have access tracks on top of them. So your ability to drive along the top of that bank when there isn't an event occurring, so they also afford ongoing access into these parks. But during a managed event, they're of a raised nature that enables you to contain water into the floodplain. We do need to get water back into the floodplain, either back into the river, either through existing creeks, but within the containment banks themselves as well. They have spillways in them, so they're slightly lower points along a bank that affords water to go across the bank in the event that our inundation gets we get a little excited and overfill slightly. So they're a control point there. But more importantly, during a managed event, as the river rises, they afford a connection across the bank and avoid any great difference in water across the bank as water levels rise in a natural event. The last one that I really wanted to touch on was a drop structure, or what we call a drop structure. So that's the entry point from an existing creek or flood runner back into the River Murray. During a managed event, the River Murray itself may be lower than the water in the landscape, particularly if we've run a pumped event. So the water level in the River Murray is lower than what is in the floodplain itself, where we're running a managed event. So there is a need to control the movement of that water back into the River Murray to avoid erosion and any damage to the river bank. So there will be points where what's called a drop structure, it affords us the ability to return water back to the River Murray in a controlled manner. Yep. Thanks, Rachel. And there are details on, and we'll point you to the various chapters and volumes of the approvals document, but within the map book series there are engineering drawings of the various structures, including regulators, containment banks and drop structures within the map book series. So it does afford you the ability to go away and have a look at those. We'll point you to the various locations where you can find those and familiarise yourself with those structures in more detail. Similar to Nyah, so running through a similar set of slides, same thing again, the blue being the maximum inundation area, yellow being construction footprint, and giving you a sense, what is a useful image here is the degree or the relatively small area proportionally of construction footprint to the inundation area. So that is area-wise, proportionally wise, or percentage-wise, that is a very low number. So relatively small construction footprint compared to inundation area. Thanks. Again, largely similar range of infrastructure. So Nyah, Vinifera and Burra all have very similar range of infrastructure proposed here, from large regulators to small regulators, drop structures, again, the ability to provide a location for temporary pumping. There's some banks and associated tracks on top of those banks. So again, they are proximate to each other. The infrastructure is quite similar. The area of maximum inundation area is quite similar. So largely they are a very similar set of projects, a very similar set of infrastructure, both in terms of scale and extent and nature of infrastructure. Thanks. The last of the three projects, and certainly by no means the least, Burra Creek. Again, a similar image there, blue being the extent of maximal inundation. Burra Creek has a slightly different feature to the other two you've seen, a slightly longer creek line coming into Burra Creek, so Burra Creek South, sort of the bottom of the image, leading into Burra Creek North towards the top. And what you might have picked up with the yellow construction footprint on the left-hand side, so the dark black line sort of dissecting top to bottom is the Murray Valley Highway, and the yellow sort of square and long yellow line leading in, that is the location of a borrow area where we would be extracting material from a private landowner who's agreed to have that material extracted from their land, and we would take that to the project site for construction purposes. Thanks. Again, a little bit of repetition here, similar range of infrastructure, similar area in terms of maximum inundation, as well as you've seen with Nyah and Vinifera. So yeah, not a lot more to say there. Really would direct you to the map book series for more detail on the nature of these structures, extent of containment banks, both linear length and elevation relative to the existing surface levels through these areas. Thanks. This is, and you know, I'm sure, fortunately for all of you, actually, this is the last slide from me for the moment. So this is pointing you to what the image you have there is a summary of what makes up the environment report in terms of documents, volumes, etc. A couple of items from an infrastructure perspective, what we've just talked about, pertinent to make a note of. So Chapter 6 provides detailed information on infrastructure and operations, so far more detailed than what I've been through tonight. But equally importantly is the map book series, which is volume 4 of attachment 1. Within that is a range of maps showing project areas for each of the 3 projects, aspects of those project areas, but towards the back of the map book series for each of the projects are a set of engineering drawings as well that show the nature of the infrastructure that is to be constructed. James, who'll join or who'll pick up items from here, will provide a little bit more detail about some of the other elements that make up the environment report and where you might go for those pieces of information. Thanks, James.
Thanks for that, Josh. Conscious of time as well, so I'll try and move through this relatively quickly. If we have any questions come up through the way, there's obviously the Q&A function down the side there, so drop any questions in there and we'll see how we go with answering them. I'm going to start with just touching briefly on, Josh obviously talked about the designs and the infrastructure itself, but in terms of operating it, I'll touch on that briefly. Mallee CMA will be responsible for the operation, particularly from the proposals and plans for watering and where and how often, and that'll happen within the existing environmental water framework that exists, that is really built on principles of adaptive management to ensure that the lessons learned from previous events and from other sites even are applied and adopted through going forward. Within the infrastructure itself, there's inherent flexibility in how that is used to ensure that water gets where it's needed. The infrastructure itself will be owned and maintained by Lower Murray Water, and Lower Murray will also operate that under instruction from Mallee CMA, following the allocation of water within that framework. There is a fairly comprehensive explanation of all of that and the various roles and responsibilities through construction and operation in Chapter 20 of the Environment Report and the Environmental Management Framework. I guess operation is really guided by 3 key components, and these are consistent across all of the VMFRP projects. Each of the projects has 1 or more water management areas that can be inundated together or separately, depending on what outcomes are being sought and what targeted vegetation we're seeking to water. The design of the infrastructure allows for that, and as I said, is allowed or designed to allow for maximum flexibility. And there are a number of operating scenarios. So that is really talking to the types of vegetation that we'll target, how often we'll target those vegetation types, and for how long. Different vegetation has evolved, obviously, on the floodplain over decades and millennia prior to human intervention, with natural flows, responding to the different frequencies and duration of inundation. So it's certainly not a matter of filling up that maximum inundation area that you saw on previous slides every year. That's too much water for the environment. So it is targeted based on those historic flows and trying to replicate those historic events and really meet the ecological needs of the floodplain. I guess these projects aren't new. They've been bouncing around a little while now through various stages of development, from initiation, creation, inception back in 2010, through business cases, various investigations, and really since late 2019, gearing up into the approvals processes, which I'll talk through bit by bit shortly as we go. So in terms of where we're at now, our environment report is on public exhibition until the 10th of March. Included in that documentation, we have quite large technical assessments spanning, I think it's 13 different technical specialist areas. We have those, if you like, condensed down into more digestible forms in the chapters in the main volumes of the environment report. We also have the planning scheme amendment that is available to review. We also have a number of accompanying documents that were relatively hot off the press at the last minute, but they're on the website and available at the information centres where we've got the documentation on exhibition. As part of the exhibition, we've had a few info sessions in the last few days where members of community have dropped in and had some conversations with us to learn a bit more about the team and the documentation. And perhaps most importantly for the approvals process, this public exhibition phase is really to help the community become informed about the projects, the assessments, the potential benefits, the potential impacts of construction and operation of these projects, to help the community make a submission into the process. I will talk more about that shortly. And then obviously, once we go through at the end of what you're seeing on your screen now, past the approval decisions, assuming the projects are approved, we obviously then move into construction. I'm trying to juggle two screens here. So why are we doing an environment report? You may be familiar with the environment effects statement that has just gone through its public hearings for ES Central, for Hatta and Belsa. This is a bit of a different beast. It's a bit of a technicality, but the documentation, if you've looked at both, there is a lot of similarities in terms of the size and the scope of the documents. But each of the 9 VMFRP projects was separately referred to the Minister for Planning under the Environment Effects Act a few years ago. Each of those referrals outlined the potential benefits of the project and the potential impacts. The Minister looked at those referrals and the supporting information and decided that these 3 projects should be assessed in a single environment report. As I said, it's almost identical to an ES. The key difference is that at this stage, instead of a public hearing, in the format that we've just had for those 2 projects, the Minister's indicated that it's more likely we'll have a roundtable forum. A little bit less formal and more of a discussion between submitters who wish to participate, members of the inquiry appointed by the Minister, and our specialists. This is what the documentation looks like. This is what it comprises. It's big, obviously, but really it comprises a summary document that you don't see in that photo. It's not technically part of the environment report, but it really does provide a very important function and a high-level overview of the entire shooting match. I always recommend that is the first thing that someone picks up to look at, and then you can drill down through volumes 1 to 4, which gives you more detail on the background, the context, project development over time, the project description. It also talks through the environment effects statement, how we're going to manage the potential impacts, adverse impacts of the projects, and how we're going to realise the benefits. Those volumes are really as clearly as we can laid out in layman's terms to really help the community digest it. That's kind of in contrast to the specialist assessments, which are really in-depth technical scientific assessments. And they are more geared towards a specialist audience. but absolutely there is information in there that will be of interest and relevant to the community. So it's all on display for anyone to pick up and have a look at. I mentioned we've got some accompanying documents. They're also relevant to the assessments, and they're also available for the community to help make more informed submissions should you choose to make one. This is where where the documentation is available. It's on our ER portal, which you can access via that link there. There's hard copies on display at those 3 venues. We also have a number of USBs available with the documentation available on USB. It's a bit awkward on the website to download everything. It's quite large, but if someone would like a USB, absolutely, by all means, please do reach out to the project team and we'll be able to get one out to you. With submissions, the public exhibition is open until then, until the 10th of March. I should also mention the planning scheme amendment is an important part of this process as well. What we're proposing to do, very consistent with obviously with ES Central, but also with infrastructure projects across Victoria. Look to streamline approvals under the Planning and Environment Act by turning off the planning permit requirements and replacing those requirements with a set of conditions in what's called an incorporated document. That incorporated document, we have a draft on exhibition at the moment. Given that that effectively replaces the planning permit requirements for the project, you know, we do have to meet those conditions, and there's approvals within that required by the minister or the secretary of the department and various others. It is an important piece of the puzzle. We do recommend that people have a look at that if planning schemes are of interest, and the submissions are there to as a formal avenue to have your say and provide input into the process. So for submissions to count or to be lodged by the website on the screen, but for them to count in accordance with state policy, it's worth pointing out that you do need to provide personal information such as name, address and contact details, and also accept that your submission, not the personal contact details, but a redacted version of your submission, will be a public document. That process is all handled by Planning Panels Victoria to maintain independence from the project and how those submissions are received and processed. They're given to the committee, who will look at those. They're also given to us to respond to, and we do that by themes and issues, and there's a number of different ways we can do that. But certainly there is the expectation and the requirement on us to respond to those. There's no direct response to individual submissions. It's worth clarifying that point as well. I've mentioned the committee a couple of times, or the inquiry. I probably shouldn't, but I do use that somewhat interchangeably. The Minister for Planning has appointed a standing inquiry and advisory committee to assess the projects across the board. There's a pool of about 15 individuals in that standing committee, and they're appointed to individual packages. And we have now recently had the committee appointed for ER Central. Again, all that information is on the Engage Vic website. So they'll review our assessments and planning scheme amendment, accompanying documentation. They'll review all of the submissions. They'll identify the themes and issues that they want to explore through this, that they feel might need a bit of extra explanation or a little bit more context, or something they're not very clear on, or where submissions raise a conflicting point of view. They'll conduct, we anticipate, they'll conduct a roundtable forum. So as I said before, it's a bit of a less formal version of the public hearing, we're still a bit unclear on exactly what this looks like and how it will work, but we'll certainly communicate more information when that's available. But the committee will invite submitters to take part in that discussion with them and the relevant specialists. So it's more of a discussion if that roundtable does progress through to that format. It's more of a discussion than sort of that formal expert witness cross-examination style of the recent ES public hearing. After that hearing's done, they'll go and deliberate, make their recommendations to the Minister for Planning, and those recommendations will typically follow one of three themes. It will either be, the project should proceed as proposed, or the project should proceed with recommended changes, and that may be to any aspect of the project, to the design, to proposed construction methods, to environmental management and controls, to the systems and frameworks that we're looking to put around, to the mitigation measures that we're proposing to put up. They may also recommend that the project should not proceed. The inquiry does maintain pretty fierce independence on that, and their report is provided straight through to the Minister for Planning. I'll touch on what the Minister for Planning does in a sec, but this public inquiry, as I said, anticipate a roundtable. We understand at this point in time that will commence on the 13th of April and expect that to last up to 2 weeks. To indicate interest in participation in that, similar to the ES, through the submission form, I believe you need to indicate that you would like to be heard or take part in those discussions. And anyone who makes a submission will be notified about key dates and processes closer to the period after the exhibition period is closed. As I said, the committee provide their report directly through to the Minister for Planning. The Minister for Planning will take that report and prepare an assessment usually within 25 business days. That's consistent with the ministerial guidelines. Once the Minister's assessment's been finalised, the department or the Minister will publish both the Minister's assessment and that SEAC report if the Minister deems it appropriate to do so. And convention is both those two reports get published at the same time. We won't see, and the public won't see, the SEAC report prior to that point, not until the Minister's assessment is finalised. Once that Minister's assessment is out, that will also contain recommendations and those same three themes, and then the various regulatory decision makers take that assessment into account and decide whether or not to approve the projects. So in that vein, I think the key takeaway or the key understanding here through the ER is that it's not itself an approval application. It's an assessment to ultimately inform decision makers. So since the projects were referred in 2020, we've continued to undertake investigations, more detailed investigations, quite far-reaching investigations into the potential benefits and impacts of the projects. We've really looked at the existing assets, values and uses out there. That's a really generic term because we're not just looking at the ecological values, we're looking at social infrastructure, we're looking at private infrastructure. We have obviously irrigation infrastructure through some of these areas and definitely adjacent to some of these areas. Social impact assessments have looked at how these forests are used for camping and other recreational purposes. So we've responded to the scoping requirements that have been issued by the Minister for Planning, and part of that is to undertake these investigations, quantify the impacts, understand what they are, and then circle back to the project scope to see how we can further avoid and minimise those potential effects. And that's either through changes to project footprints or the infrastructure size, how we're going to build things And a lot of that is documented, or all of that is documented in the environment report. We've also then looking at the environmental controls that we have in place and the actions that we'll put in place during construction, during operation to minimise those effects. That's involved reviewing designs, as I said, constructability reviews, the specialist assessments, extensive survey, extensive engagement with traditional owners, as Josh touched on, traditional owners and interested parties, and obviously the ecological assessments have, take up a lot of airspace in the, or paper space in the environment reports, and the methodologies that we've undertaken to inform those assessments are consistent with targeted survey methodologies, DELP requirements through that assessor's handbook as well. So there's a lot of established precedent and requirements and scopes for how surveys are done, and we've systematically worked through those processes. What we've managed to achieve, in the order of 30 various refinements across the projects that entirely avoided or minimised the adverse effects. Believe it's in the order of 100 large trees that we've been able to retain, and then there's a further 20 alternatives that we haven't been able to make a call on yet to this point. We need assistance through the constructability and the detailed design process as to whether we can achieve more savings. And certainly the project has committed quite clearly in the environmental delivery standards to ensure that that avoid and minimise process continues through the design phase and into construction. So that will be a concerted effort by the contractors, environment or designers, environment teams, and our approvals team as well, to make sure that that process continues deep into project delivery. And I've mentioned this a few times, that a lot of that detail is set out in Chapter 4, Project Development, that describes the results and the process and results at a higher level. And then a lot of the detail and specific examples is provided in Attachment 7. It's worth noting, Attachment 7, a number of maps and figures are redacted from public display. That's due to sensitivities around cultural heritage information. There's information in there that the regulators, that the Minister for Planning, for example, needs to know, but it's not appropriate to put that information out into the public domain. So if you do see those redactions through that, please have confidence that the decision makers and the panel, the inquiry, those people have that information. But as I said, that's there to really protect those cultural heritage values. That's both a legal requirement and also at the request of the traditional owner groups. And I think with that, Josh, I might be handing back to you.
Thanks, James. And we're a quick period of time. Noted we started a bit later, so we're happy to afford more time here for general Q&A. There were some questions that came in, and I'm happy to touch on those now. They came in prior to the meeting, people when they registered. What I'll do is sort of read out those questions as a starting point, and there were a couple that came in through the chat as well, which I'll touch on. But the questions we got prior to was how much water is proposed to inundate the Nyah Vinifera wetland, and what does this equate to in average depth over entire area? What I will say is that that is all contained. That information is contained in Volume 1. Chapter 6, and I touched on the area there through the slides, but similarly, Volume 1, Chapter 6, project description, contains that information and sets out the detail around water depths across the floodplain, noting it does vary across the floodplain from a river through to some of the shallower areas. So do refer to Volume 1, Chapter 6 for that one. How long is it proposed to leave the water on site, and will it become stagnant or a health hazard for humans, aquaculture, flora and fauna? So again, the project description, Chapter 6, in particular Section 6.2 and 6.3 provide some operational information, and it will provide operational information on duration of inundation events, but they are typically of the order of 4 to 5 months for an event at these particular locations, and they would typically be in the cooler months, late winter, early spring sort of horizons, rather than in the peak of summer. From a managed perspective, on the tail end of a higher river level event, that would be more opportunistic, and depending on the timing and the operational objectives, one might sort of piggyback off a receding river or a high river level event. The management of water quality, so stagnant water, human health, etc., that is captured under the environmental delivery standards and the environmental management framework. So the monitoring and management of water quality, surface water quality in particular, but equally groundwater, is addressed in those sections of the report. Another question: what controls will be put in place to ensure water does not escape to the adjoining farmlands and residential dwellings located downstream and or nearby the project sites? Look, the construction of the containment banks, and they are more containing, so most of the water actually does, the challenge is more keeping it on the floodplain rather than having it escape back, and it tends to escape back to the river for these particular project sites. So, but there are a couple of instances, Burra Creek being one, and Nyah from memory as well, where there is some existing infrastructure, levee banks, etc., that protect private land. Intention is that those would afford those protections. Our containment banks are inside the park. They're a much lower level as well. So in that setting, those banks will manage the water in a managed event, and the location of those banks, the height and extent of those, is set out in Volume 4 map book. The banks that we're looking to construct, they'll be owned and managed by Lower Murray Water, and they'll also be monitored during managed events to ensure ongoing integrity during and not breaching or failing. So hopefully that gives some comfort around that component. There was a question around let's call it liability insurance, etc., in the event of a breach or a managed event escaping onto private land at a high level. Lower Murray Water would, as the operator of that infrastructure, its insurance provisions in the event of a failure would afford protection to the landowners, but under natural events, these Lower Murray Water's insurance wouldn't kick in, and that would be the private landowners' requirements under natural events. But under managed events, Lower Murray Water would be insured, and would landowners would have recourse back through Lower Murray Water in the event of a failure in a managed event. There's some discussion around protection of cultural heritage and impacts to cultural heritage. That is dealt with in Volume 5 in the documentation, an overview of that. There are also some environmental delivery standards that talk to ongoing monitoring and management of cultural heritage across these sites as well. So it's recognised and documented both in terms of what we've found and the values there, and how they would be monitored and managed during operation. And yes, so there was a couple around heritage and noting on the more recent flooding, more recent natural flooding that occurred, all pretty familiar with that. Parks Victoria are still in the process of assessing the extent of that flooding, any damage, any effects there, and how they will manage any of the effects with heritage in the national park or in these parks. And I think there was one more we had. Yes, no, two more pertinent ones. Bushfire risk. People asking the question, do these projects increase bushfire risk? Some effort was gone to, and that is documented around risk assessments on bushfire risk. The summary was, and James, correct me if I'm wrong, but really existing management practices are suitable and appropriate, and the bushfire risk increase, there isn't a if managed correctly, there is an increase in bushfire risk, is a summary. But sections where are we here? The risk assessments presented in sections 6.2, 9 and 12 of the volume 5. So refer to volume 5, provides an overview of that. And the last one we had pre the session was the containment banks, and pertinent and topical with recent flooding. Do these containment banks alter river flow, river behaviour, increase flooding in other areas, and particularly in just across the river in New South Wales? The summary answer is no. The banks are relatively low and would be inundated and inconsequential, in a river or a flood event that would be over bank and would have well and truly drowned out these the existing or proposed containment banks. So summary answer to construction of the banks has no material effect to existing flood behaviour and or flood modelling. So they were those questions. There were a couple of other questions that came in. The difference between constraints and VMFRP. Look, the key point of difference, VMFRP, the infrastructure, has the ability to influence for the better the duration of an event, and also the ability to reach higher parts of the floodplain that constraints won't achieve. There is more information on constraints, as I said, at the website there that provides a little more detail on that. Another one, will VMFRP infrastructure prevent some existing areas from getting natural inundation? Short answer is, well, no, in that natural inundation, and by the nature of the sizing and location of VMFRP, natural inundation would drown out our infrastructure and would reach some of these other areas. So really our infrastructure is targeted to managed events predominantly, or the opportunistic river events that come along, and our ability to hold that water onto the landscape for a longer duration than may be the case with a particular flood event. Yep. So they were the two themes that are pertinent to VMFRP. I think there was a third question, particularly around the scope of constraints and extent of constraints. That's really a scope item for for the constraints project will pass that information and question on to the constraints team, and I'm sure they would be in position to reach out and have a discussion on that particular matter. Yep. So they were the main questions. More, we'll be able to afford a more detailed response, but I thought it appropriate to at least touch on that and give people a sense of where one might find some more information to deal with those particular questions, and or at least some comfort that some of these questions are in hand. Yep. And I think that was all that we had from a closing perspective. Hopefully that was informative. At the very least, gives you a sense of where the projects are from a geographic setting, what they are, why we're doing them, importantly, and where to go to get more detailed information in the immediate term, how to make a submission, and the pathway from here to be heard, if you'd like to participate or at least be present during the upcoming inquiry, and what occurs leading up to the minister's assessment, the minister's decision. So hopefully that was at least informative. If nothing else, there is always the opportunity to ask more questions of us through the various mechanisms that we have, either making a submission. You can email the VMFRP information email address. We respond to those as well. So there are a few avenues if you have particular questions, and or the ability to reach out to us and seek more information or make submissions, and they'll be attended to through the upcoming inquiry process. And I think that will well, that will certainly pull me up, and hopefully others have gotten everything out of it for this evening. I wish you a pleasant evening, and where you are, it's not as warm as it is here in Mildura, but nonetheless, a good evening, and thank you for attending.